I'm joined, of course, by the irrepressible young James Giles at this hour. Let's start with that. James, you're a young person. Do you think this COP26 is much COP?
I really don't at all. I mean, all it, of course, is doing is sending world leaders thousands of miles on aeroplanes, generating CO2.
Why couldn't have done it by video, by Zoom?
Well, that would have made far more sense, not only because of the pandemic, but also in light of the goal they're supposedly trying to achieve. But given that, some really major global players are not coming to COP26, Russia, China, and others too, there really is very little point. There'll be no matters of substance agreed that will be of any use to save the planet, as your poll says. And so really, it's just a talking shop that not only will generate a load of CO2 from travel, but also generate a huge amount of hot air from all the people in the room.
Why did Boris Johnson agree to hold it in Glasgow? There are several reasons why he might not have. One of them is that Glasgow, I say this as someone who lived there and represented Glasgow in Parliament for many years, has never been dirtier in my lifetime. And Glasgow was once really, no mean city. But rats are running wild. The bin men are on strike, not least because they're endangered by the rats. The railway workers are on strike. And of course, it's giving his potential nemesis, or would-be nemesis, Nicola Sturgeon, a day in the sun. Why do that?
Well, I think it's a foolish move, but it's a move I would imagine that was made some time ago, before the rubbish really began mounting up and all the rest of it. But, I mean, there's benefits in the one hand. Boris Johnson, if it goes well, can say, this is what we've achieved in the Union, this is global Britain, of course, a post-Brexit Britain that's reaching out to the world on a global mission to reduce carbon emissions. But the reality is that it really won't achieve much. It will cost a huge amount to the taxpayer. There's a no-fly zone that's being imposed across the entire Central Belt. Joe Biden himself is staying just outside of Edinburgh and will need to be helicoptered in to these meetings in Glasgow. So the airspace is reserved for President Biden. And so it's really only generating carbon emissions, and to very little gain, I think, for Boris Johnson and indeed the country.
Why are the Russians and the Chinese not coming?
Well, the Chinese haven't completely ruled out sending a delegation, but the Chinese premier won't himself be attending. Perhaps
because they feel attacked?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, China has been in the news a huge amount since announcing that Xi Jinping wouldn't be attending. It's not perhaps the best way to foster good relations between Britain and China, or the world and China, but ultimately there will be nothing of substance that can be agreed. And so what is the point, really, in any country, sending your head of state to a summit where it's just a talking shop? Send a delegation, by all means, but there's nothing actually on the table of substantive nature that will make a difference to reducing global emissions.
Now, of course, Parliament moves on, British politics moves on, even after such an horrific crime as was committed on Friday with Sir David Amess. You've got news, I think, about the by-election, which will inevitably have to be held in the stead of Sir David. The other parties are not going to contest it.
Well, Labour and the Liberal Democrats have announced that they won't be fielding a candidate. I personally think that's only right and proper. Of course, when the late Jo Cox was murdered in 2016 in Batley and Spen, none of the major parties stood in the subsequent by-election in honour of her memory. And indeed, David Amess was an MP that was respected across the House, regardless of one's politics. Almost everyone who met him can agree that he was a thoroughly decent
He was very
human
likeable.
being.
I don't know anyone that didn't like him.
Indeed. And so,
including the workers in the building, by the way, which is always a good yardstick.
Absolutely. And so Labour and the Liberal Democrats have already announced this. I would imagine the Greens to follow suit very shortly. You'll, of course, get the fringe nutters, frankly, standing. In Batley and Spen, you had the English Democrats standing, a party called Liberty GB. So, you can expect the Britain Firsts of this world to be putting up candidates.
The far right will put up candidates because they'll try to turn it into a race war, a religion war.
Of course, you can expect probably Jada Franson and a few other ugly faces turning up, in addition to probably a host of independents who fancy their chances in a by-election. But it's only really right and proper, I think, that the main parties do stand aside. I mean, the man was murdered. You know, he's not resigned to take up
you see,
one
a lot
job.
of people are asking me online here, what's the difference between why is one man's life more important than another? Here's the difference. He was elected by the people in his area to represent them. He was murdered whilst going about his job to represent them. That's the difference. Other victims of murder were not picked by their whole community to represent them, and then the community was robbed of that by one individual, let's hope it's only one individual, that takes it upon themselves to end that man's life. That's the difference.
Oh, it is, but there's a real big point here, which is what happens now for the remaining 648 MPs in Parliament. Of course, James Brokenshire also tragically passed away from cancer. So for the other 648 currently sitting, what now? Because, you know, lots of them rightly don't feel safe in their communities. There's a lack of close protection when MPs are out and about in their constituency. But there's a real tightrope here that I think it's a difficult balance to get right. You want MPs to be accessible to the public. You want them out and about in communities. But equally, you know, it's not right that anyone should be unsafe doing their job, doing their duties. And so the government really needs to take a quick but hard think about what to do when it comes to MP security.
Well, look, you can I did surgeries for nearly 30 years. I'm not going to mythologize them. Many of the cases were hopeless cases. Many of them were not really my job in the first place. Many of them were councillors' business rather than parliamentary business. I'm not going to idealize or mythologize them. But if you're going to do it, and the public want it, it's quite clear from the numbers that come, why can't you have a police officer with a PSO, police support officer, with a metal detector, running over the public as they come in? There are many shops, clubs, football grounds where you have to get metal detected. Why not do that? That's quite simple. It's only 3 hours, 4 hours on a Friday or a Saturday.
Well, indeed, it would make sense. And in addition to that measure, which actually wouldn't be a hugely costly measure either, MPs also, I think, need to reevaluate how they go about doing surgeries. David Amess was proud to have an open door policy, so anyone could literally turn up, as this gentleman did, to his surgery.
Are you sure about that? Because I read reports that he had been planning this for a week. They know this because he was in touch with the MP's office a week before and made an appointment.
Well, indeed, and David's policy was that you could make an appointment and he'd see appointments first, but he also had an open door policy.
Okay.
And many MPs, especially now coming out of COVID, are holding outdoor street surgeries, and all of that will need to be reevaluated in light of this. You know, is it still safe for an elected representative to be out on the streets talking to the public? And I think the discourse that's come in recent months from people like Angela Rayner, thinking namely of the Tory scum incident, really does nothing to actually try and build a gentler politics and, frankly, a more human politics.
And, of course, the punishment scarcely fits the crime. In my own case, as you know, someone was tried for thrice online threatening to put a bullet through my head, and the punishment was community service.
Indeed.
I mean, why is that not an imprisonable offence? To threaten 3 times to put a bullet through the head of a candidate in an election?
Well, there's not really much that can be said about that. I mean, it's a petty sentence for what is a very serious offence, and the police can't possibly have known whether or not that threat or any threat that is received by a candidate or someone in elected office is, if you can call it a joke or not serious, or whether they are actually going to follow through on it. And it's impossible to tell. And so therefore, the police have a responsibility to treat every such threat seriously, or at least in my mind anyway, that would be logical.